Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and this week contract tip has to do with the 2018 GAR listing agreement and the termination of that listing agreement. So in 2018, the GAR Contracts Forms Committee, I am on F1, Exclusive Seller Listing Agreement. Under paragraph A2, where it talks about the listing term, it describes the listing term, and it says listing period. This term shall begin on, and you fill in a listing date when the listing begins, and shall end on, and you fill in a termination date, an expiration date of the listing agreement. And that time frame is henceforth called the listing period. So that's always been in the listing agreements, and as you know from license law, you must put in an end date to a listing agreement. But in the 2018 version of the GAR listing form, they eliminated the verbiage. It still had all that information, and then after that time frame, GAR had a sentence that said, unless otherwise terminated in accordance with this agreement. Well, we don't really want to sign up a client to a listing agreement and then further go on and explain to them how they terminate this agreement. And if you are a seller watching, we really don't want you to hire us and then turn around to fire us. However, there is a seller may terminate a listing agreement, and for that matter, a broker may also terminate the listing agreement with the seller. The issue is the broker can be fired from representation, but not necessarily from compensation. So if a seller terminates a listing agreement, they're terminating the representation, they're terminating the client relationship, but there are still fees and compensation that is required of the seller upon early termination. So further on in the listing agreement, under paragraph C1, other terms and conditions, it describes the compensation for the seller default. And it specifically says, in the event the seller defaults under this agreement, which an early termination would be default. If you're terminating it earlier than when it's set to expire, then it's a default under this agreement. The seller shall, in accordance with its other obligations set forth elsewhere herein, reimburse the broker the out-of-pocket costs and expenses incurred by the broker and the broker's affiliated licensees in seeking to market and sell the property. Such costs and expenses shall include, without limitation, printing and copying charges, mileage at the current rate that the IRS will allow for a deduction for mileage, expenses for advertising the property in various media, and the seller shall also pay cost, fees, and charges for removing the listing from any multiple listing service. The paragraph under the default further goes on to say that the payment of these costs, fees, and charges and expenses by the seller shall not waive or limit the broker's rights to assert any claim, cause of action or lawsuit, or claim of any damages. And it does not release the seller from the claims, notwithstanding anything to the above. So if there is a lawsuit, if the seller makes a compensation to the brokerage for the fees incurred, and there is still a lawsuit about it, if the judgment goes in favor of the brokerage, then whatever fees the seller has already paid will be deducted from the amount awarded to the brokerage, and that verbiage is in there. So if a seller wants to terminate, or again, if the broker wants to terminate the agreement and release the seller, then it needs to be in writing. And GAR has two forms. They have a unilateral termination of the brokerage engagement, and they have a mutual termination of the brokerage engagement. So the unilateral is GAR form F87, unilateral termination of brokerage agreement. And it has a place on here because it depends on if the client is terminating the agreement or if the broker is terminating the agreement. So on this form, it's divided into two, and the first half is a place for the seller to sign. It just says client because these would also be the forms you would use if you are terminating a buyer brokerage agreement, but for the purposes of this video, we're talking about the listing agreement. Termination by client, you fill in the name, the brokerage, the dates, and then it says the termination is effective either immediately or you pick a specific time. It further states, in terminating the agreement, the broker is directed by the client not to perform real estate brokerage services on behalf of the client after the termination date of this notice. Nothing herein shall be construed as an agreement between the client and the broker to mutually terminate the agreement or to limit, waive, or terminate the broker's rights to commission or reimbursement of expenses. The other form you can use is a mutual termination of the brokerage engagement, and that is GAR Form F89. And that goes into a little bit more depth, and that does require both the brokerage's signature as well as the client's signature. So again, you fill out the information about the listing, the property address, the brokerage, the seller, and then you put in a date for termination, and then it has a paragraph where you can negotiate, the broker and the seller negotiate the terms of this mutual termination. So it says, upon mutual termination of this agreement, the parties shall have no further rights or responsibilities to one another other than the following, which the parties agree shall expressly survive this agreement. And then it has check boxes, which you can select one, all, or multiple. The first one has to do with the protection period, and it says the protected period under the brokerage engagement shall expressly survive the termination of the brokerage engagement. The next option is simultaneously with the execution of this agreement, the client shall pay the broker X amount of dollars, and you fill in that amount, to reimburse the broker for the fees, costs, and expenses incurred by the broker in connection with this agreement. Next option says the client shall also pay the broker X amount of dollars in full and final settlement of any and all claims, causes of action, suits, and damages to the broker arising out of or relating to this agreement. And then there's a place for other where you can negotiate other terms. And that form would require both the client and the seller signature as well as the broker signature. Now, to terminate an agreement, so again, GAR took all that verbiage out of the listing agreement where it describes all the proper method to terminate. But again, you can be fired, but you can't be fired from compensation, just from representation. And again, as I mentioned, the broker can fire the client as well. It must be in writing. So it has to be, that's why GAR provides these forms. It must be in writing from the seller to the broker, and it must be signed that they do wish to terminate the listing agreement. And again, I would suggest that you use these forms so that everybody is on the same page regarding what compensation is charged, and that the seller is required to pay for defaulting on the contract. Now, this compensation has to do with those expenses. It's not necessarily for commission issues. That's a whole nother video for another day. But wanted to bring this to your attention. When a seller does compensate the broker for these fees for the early termination, that check is payable to the brokerage. It is not payable directly to the agent, but all fees go to the brokerage. So those termination fees would go to the brokerage. Also, there's a charge, I think I read it, but that the seller is required to pay the charges to withdraw the listing from the MLS services. And again, those fees get paid to the broker, not directly to the MLS services, because the seller is not a member of FMLS or Georgia MLS or any other MLS you belong to, but the broker is a member of those services. So you sellers out there watching, and you agents, it's not that we want you to terminate these listing agreements. We want to provide amazing service for you, get your home sold. Again, the same goes through for the buyer brokerage agreements, but this video has to do with the listing. So we don't want you to terminate the agreements. We want to provide amazing service to help you with all of your real estate needs. And if, however, for whatever reason, there is a case to terminate, you agents, you need to do it in writing with the proper forms. And you sellers, there is still compensation involved. And again, I did not get into the commission aspect of an early termination, but did want to bring this to your attention in general, and especially also because GAR did make that change in the listing agreement and the buyer brokerage agreement for 2018. So you public people out there, we are really excited to offer our services and provide you with amazing service to help you with all of your real estate needs. And you agents out there watching, hopefully this contract tip helped you out. Well, hopefully it didn't. Hopefully this never ever comes up in your entire career. But did want to let you know what was going on. And I thank you so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, information, and education, and innovation, and all kinds of other Asians. Thank y'all so much for watching.